So at the end of today's presentation, you probably will not feel the simplicity. You probably will feel a bit overwhelmed by the research methodology, but I want to emphasize this is something new, and I just want to throw it out there. And when we try to develop the methodology, we aim for comprehensive. But at the end of today's presentation, I will also give you some examples about how different people involved in the government use the toolkit differently. You don't have to go through everything I present. Today I just want to give you an overview about the research, about the methodology we have come up with. So my name is Ying-Yi Chih, and I'm a senior lecturer in project management at the Research School of Management at ANU. So as you know, my background is in project management. So project management, my research area focus mainly similar to content group, government project management. We try to look for issues and see how we can help government better manage the government project. So that's my research area. So when David come to me, and then I find that it's interesting, both of us are trying to help government address different kind of issues. But I think that's a very good common interest. So what I would like to do today is just to give you an overview about the methodology we have developed. In the past 10 months or so, 9 months or 10 months, we have been working with content groups to develop an evidence-based approach to facilitate effective content communication practice in the government. And so that's what we have done. And this project, as David mentioned, is co-funded by the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science in Australia and content group. So it's a collaboration between university and the industry. So what I would like to do today is just to give you a bit background information about the project and also the research aim, and I will also briefly walk through the principle and process we follow to develop the toolkit or the methodology we come up with. And I will give you an overview of the methodology. I may use the term toolkit from now on just to keep it simple. So I will give you an overview of the evidence-based toolkit. And then, as David mentioned, we have, in the process, we have talked to several government agency representatives. They are interested in taking part of the research. So we have conducted semi-structured interview with various government agency representative. So I will also share, in the process, I will also share with you our finding, their perception. So you will be able to see how the people in industry actually perceive this toolkit we came up with. And so at the end, I will conclude with some examples of how different participant or communication teams in government may use the toolkit differently, and what would be the benefit the toolkit can deliver to the organization as a whole. And then I will conclude with some next step. And we, as David mentioned, we collaborate. We actually collaborate, and we will welcome any collaborative opportunity. And then if you have any interesting example, and if you want to validate or test the toolkit we develop here in your organization, please feel free to just keep in touch. So before I jump into the toolkit itself, I just want to point out, given the time constraint, I won't be able to get into all the details in today's presentation, but I will give you an overview and give you some examples of the detailed information we will cover in the toolkit. So as I said, if you have any questions, you are welcome to just ask at the end of today's presentation, or if you have any comments and what are the additional information you would like to see in the toolkit. This development is an ongoing process. We anticipate the toolkit will be the development of this will be an ongoing effort, and we welcome any thought about this. So David have mentioned there is actually a recent global study conducted by WPP, and this is one problem they have find involving throughout the global survey of the many different countries. So I think this quote from their report summarized the challenge facing global different government agencies around the world very well. So they said there is a shared sense among the communication team leaders in all government agencies. Their teams lacks agility to manage the communication challenge nowadays. So we all know the communication, the technology make the communication more complex than ever. So in that kind of context, how the communication team can respond to different communication needs effectively without struggling through the trial and error each time. So they need to have more efficiency in their process. That's the first challenge they face. They also point out they face constant cost reduction. So what does this mean for communication? Whenever there's a budget cut, communication is the first to go. So that means, given that cost reduction, it's important for communication to build a more compelling case. You need to justify why your communication is needed for the organization. You need to build a compelling case for your communication need. You need to provide evidence. But how are you going to do that? What approach, what tools, technique can help you develop that kind of compelling case? That's the challenge they face. The third part of the challenge they face is the skill. So they don't have the talent, they don't have the sufficient skill in their team. Their team is not equipped with the appropriate skill for them to manage the complex communication problem. So there's actually a need within the organization, within the communication team, to continuously develop talent. So in that case, how they are going to do that? So I think that's the challenge facing the government agency around the globe. And with that background, this is our research objective. So basically in this research project, as David mentioned, what we are trying to do is to develop a methodology. A methodology that will outline the communication process from the very beginning all the way to the end. We will specify exactly what would be the phase, what are the phases you need to go through in order to finish, to deliver your communication. For each of the phases, what are the key activities you need to perform? And for each of the activity, what information you will need for you to perform the activity. For you to perform the activity, what kind of tools and technique that can help you with the task. At the end of each of the activity, what would be the output being generated? And how will that piece of information fit into other process of the communication process? So I think this is what we are trying to develop for this methodology. And the way we see it, this structure can serve several benefits, can have several benefits to the organization. First of all, if you have a system in place, each time when you have a new communication need coming in, you don't have to struggle. You don't have to try and error. You have a system in place. And of course, it can be applied to different contexts differently, but you have something to start with. So efficiency is something we believe this toolkit will deliver to the organization. Secondly, this toolkit can also be a valuable training material. If you have a new communicator join the team, then in that case, how are you going? There's no way, given that we are all busy with our tech, there's no way we can hold hand and train the junior communicator from. So this toolkit can also serve as the training material, and I will talk about this in more detail, and you will see how this may help with that purpose. So that's the objective. We are trying to develop a process and then divide it into phases, and we also specify the activities and the tools that can help you with each of the tasks, and I will give you some example of those as we move along. So this is the process and the principle we try to follow when we try to develop the toolkit. And I just want to quickly point out two things here. So when we try to develop the toolkit, as David mentioned, everything actually starts from content groups practice. So they have worked with government and they have developed this methodology over many years of experience. So what we are trying to do is to build evidence around that. So we want that this toolkit is not only evidence-based, we also want it to be relevant, can be actually used by the industry. So that's the first principle. Whenever we try to develop the process, we keep in mind everything needs to be evidence-based, but it also needs to be supported by the industry perception. The second principle we follow is that when we try to develop the framework, it's not about government communicating. It's about mutual communication. It's about citizens. It's about getting the message across. So when we try to develop the process, we always ask ourselves how that may be perceived by the citizen and how that may affect the interaction between the government and the citizen. So that's the second principle. And the last principle we follow here is that we all know 20 years ago, we probably won't imagine the technology will get to the today's status. So everything can change over time. So when we try to develop the toolkit, we try to structure it in a way that is leave flexibility for future update. So we want this to be able to be updated in the future. If you ever need to change the tools and techniques, if you need to restructure the framework, you have the flexibility. So that's one thing we try to actually incorporate into the development of the toolkit. And I will give you an example what I mean by that. So that's the principle. So in terms of the research process, this research project started about 9 months ago. And it's not going to end anytime soon. So the development of the toolkit will be an ongoing process. But I hope David is happy too. I'm actually quite confident and quite happy about what we have achieved because we received many encouraged comments from the industry when we talk to industry people. I think they all view this toolkit as valuable tools that can help them with their practice. So we start with the first, the entire process is divided into 4 phases. The first phase is we try to get understanding. We try to understand the content group's practice, which is developed over many years of experience. And we try to compare. We also try to look into the latest research in project management, communication, public relation, and marketing. We try to see what's available, what has been done by researchers out there. So we try to compare the content group's methodology and also with the latest research in literature. And we try to identify whether there are gaps and whether they can complement with each other. So that's the first stage. And so at the end of the second stage, we integrate the industry and evidence. We develop the draft toolkit, and we get some initial review internally and talk to different industry people for the second stage. So at the end of the second stage, we are fairly confident that we have the structure right, but we also want to see how industry view. We also want to know a bit about how the toolkit may be perceived by industry people. So we move into the stage 3. We talk to wider communication community. And then we are now approaching to the stage 4, which we are trying to revise the toolkit. So what I would like to do today is just to give you an overview of the toolkit and then also share with you some findings, some feedback we have received from the industry people. So that's so today's presentation will focus on stage 3 and stage 4. Okay. So just to give you a bit more information about what we have done with the stage 3. So as David mentioned, we actually formed the advisory groups committee, and then that consists of members from different levels of government and also across different government agencies and from Australia, UK, and Vienna. So as of today, this is still an ongoing process. As of today, we have completed a total of 14 semi-structured interviews. Each interview actually lasts for 45 minutes and some even less for 1 hour. So it's a very in-depth interview in terms of the conversation. So we have talked to different 14 representatives from different government agencies, and the communication practice does not only include strategy communication. Some of them are in charge of business as usual communication. So I think we want to see broader, we want to get a broader perception. We want to see how the toolkit may be applied to different contact, communication contact, strategy communication, and also business as usual communication. So when we talk to different people, when we talk to the advisory group members, our conversation actually focus on several things. So we send them the summary of the toolkit we developed before the interview. So during the interview, we asked them about their perception, their overall perception about the framework, the overall structure of the toolkit. And we also asked them about their perceived value of the toolkit and also some of their challenge. If they are going to implement the toolkit in their organization, what may be some challenge they would anticipate and whether there are some suggestions for overcoming those challenges. And then we also ask them some phase and activity specific questions, whether they want to see particular information being included, whether they have some suggestion for some tools, and whether they have some suggestion around some required input and so on. So that's the focus of our communication. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, when we try to develop the toolkit, we want to keep the flexibility for future update. And then after some discussion, we come up with the approach and the way to structure the toolkit, which we believe will satisfy that need. So overall, based on our communication and also literature review and the content group's practice, we find that the entire content communication can be divided into phases, individual phases. So it will include the initiation phase, and I will walk you through the phases in more detail just to give you an overview about the structure of the toolkit. So it needs to go through initiation phase, and then it will move into the planning and design phase, and at the end it will be execution and evaluation phase. And then before you can move from one phase to the next, there should be some decision-making point within the organization. So that's where those red dots represented. So there will be decision-making point embedded in the entire process before you move from one phase to the next phase. So for each of the phases, each phases will consist multiple activity you need to perform in that particular phase. Say, for example, in the planning and design phase, you need to actually perform several activities for you to complete that particular phase. And for each of the activity, for you to perform that activity, you need to have some information. So that means for each of the activity, you will need to have some input. You need to have some information available for you to perform that activity. For each of the activity, there should also be some tools, techniques that can help you perform the activity. So for you to use the information, and then there will be a tools and techniques available to help you with that particular activity. At the end of that particular activity, there will be something being generated. So there will be output being generated at the end of each of the activity. And then this output may fit into another activity. So this is how we structure the toolkit. And the reason why we believe this is flexibility for future update is that in the future, if your organization have a particular set of phase, you can just update the phase. And in the future, if the technology change or the new tools and techniques are available for a particular activity, you can just update the tools and technique without changing the entire process or changing the entire structure. And if you are working in the communication team and you are responsible for a particular activity, you don't have to go through everything. You just dive into that particular activity you are heavily involved, and you can quickly find the information you need for you to perform your task. So we believe this structure actually serves a different purpose very well. It gives the flexibility for future update, and it can give you an overview guideline, and for different people, you can just jump into your activity and then quickly find the information you need. So this is where I'm going to go through each of the phase, and I know that those of you in the back may not be able to read this, but I will give you an example in a bigger font later on, so don't worry about this. So this is just to give you an overview of the content communication methodology. So as I said, we divide the entire process right now into 3 phases. The initiation phase. So the initiation phase, this is where you build a case around your communication. So we know communication does not exist in vacuum. Communication is about something. So usually in the business setting, in the government setting, your communication will usually about a government agency's mission, a government initiative, a new program, a new policy, a new project, for example, or a government agency's mission. So the first phase is where you actually develop a deeper understanding about what you are trying to communicate for So that's where you justify, you get understanding around the government mission, and then based on the government mission, you will be able to define, you need to define your goal. What's the goals for your communication? And how will that goal fit into the entire organization? So you need to actually build a case around that. And this is also the phase you need to understand. You will definitely have constraint in terms of resource. So that means you understand the context, you define your goal, and you need to understand the resource constraint. What are the constraints, what are the timeline, the budget you may have for your communication. So at the end of this initiation phase, there should be a proposal that justify the need for your communication. And that proposal needs to be approved or reviewed by someone. So that's what we mean by decision-making point. So that's the focus of the initiation phase. Once the proposal is approved, you clearly justify the need for your communication. Now you can advance into more detailed development of your communication strategy. So the second phase, planning and design phase, focus on understanding who you are trying to communicate with, the target audience, who you are going to communicate with, and based on the mission and also the organizational strategy, what key message you want to get across. You need to understand your target audience, and you need to know their behavior driver, motivation, and you need to decide your key message, and you also need to determine, based on the target audience and the goal, in this phase, you need to decide what will be the content, what will be the distribution channel, and the challenge for this part would be what would be the right combination. What content, what message, and what distribution channel. So this is what you are trying to do in the planning and design phase. And at the end of the planning and design phase, there should be an implementation plan. So you develop a set of communication strategy, and this will be your implementation plan. This is the plan for you to roll out the communication plan. And this implementation plan will, again, need to be reviewed and approved by someone, because we are talking about government here. So we need to actually consider the credibility and also the way we spend public money. So that's the focus of the second phase. We focus on who we are trying to communicate, what information, and how we are going to reach them. So once you have the content communication strategy, and we all agree, I think we all agree, nothing will go according to plan. Nothing will go according to plan. So the next phase will focus on monitoring control. So we have this beautifully well-developed implementation plan, but some will work, some will not. So the next phase will focus on monitor and control. It means that we focus on lesson learned. We need to actually adjust the implementation, and then if something went wrong, we correct, and then we revise that. And one thing we also need to do, once you officially finish the entire communication, at the end, there should be an official review. You set a goal at the very beginning of your communication. At the end of the process, there must be something, or at this, you need to try to see whether you achieve the goal you set at the very beginning. So one thing we also try to emphasize here for this is you need to actually have an official performance review at the end, and then for each of the project, probably develop some lesson learned for future project implementation. So that's the phase 3. So when we talk to the advisory group member, we ask them about their overall perception, about the overall framework. And these are the some information we have received. So they like the idea. So I think 2 things I want to point out here is that they believe this actually, the whole process going through from initiation phase, planning, and the final execution and the evaluation, they think the whole process capture the best practice. And they particularly like the idea that we emphasize the initiation phase. I think in practice currently the view, and I think David also mentioned this, communicators are often involved at a very later stage of the process. There is really not much room for you to build your case. there's really not much room for you to set your goal. If you believe your goal, the goal for this communication should aim for behavior change, but by the time when you are involved, you can only send a message. You can only do certain things about communication. So I think what they like about this is that they like the overall picture of the process. They also like the fact it emphasizes the early involvement for a communicator in the entire process. And they think this also, the overall framework can also help them build credibility. When they try to build a case for their communication, they can say they have followed a rigorous process. It's not like my say, your say. It has been done through a particular set of steps. And they also believe it can also introduce some consistency into the organization. I think the issues they have mentioned here is that different government agencies have their own communication team. And sometimes different communication teams are trying to communicate with the same group of target audience. And they communicate with the same pool of target audience. Sometimes the message may be conflicting with each other, and sometimes it may be redundant. So they believe that if we have a systematic process in place, that can introduce certain level of consistency into the organization, especially across organization. So these are the feedback we have received, and they also believe it will be good for training. So in the future, if there are new members, they can just ask them to read. Before you can first day onward, just read the toolkit, so capability development. But they also have some concern. I'm not going to lie to you, they do have concern, and I believe you do too. It's well acknowledged. So they believe, yes, it's a good process, it's a good framework, it's very comprehensive, but it's different from what they do things currently. So it requires some change in terms of mindset. And in order for you to follow the same process, the new process, it will require some learning. So they are afraid of the learning curve, and also given that you have so many daily activity you have to manage, and how you are going to find the time for training. So that's their concern. But again, given that the benefit they perceive, they believe those are the things we need to overcome in order to implement the framework. But they are concerned about the potential learning curve associated with the framework. So now, what I would like to do next is just to give you some sense. We currently talk about 3 individual phases. But for each of the phases, at the very beginning, I also mentioned, for each of the phases, there will be specific activities you need to perform for you to complete that phase. What I would like to do next is to just go through individual phase and give you some examples about what we mean by activities and what we mean by tools and what we mean by the output, input, and so on. So initiation phase, as I mentioned, it's focused on building a case. You need to address some questions. So exactly what you are trying to communicate, and then what would be your objective, and what would be the high-level constraint around your communication. So the initiation phase focus on building a communication case. So for this particular phase, we believe there are 4 generic activities you need to perform in order for you to build a compelling case for your communication. The first one, of course, you need to analyze the context, what you are trying to communicate. If the communication is about a new program, a new government program, if the communication is about new policy, if the communication is about a new organizational vision or something, you need to first develop understanding around that particular government initiative or that strategic vision. You need to understand exactly what that government initiative is trying to achieve, who will benefit from that particular government practice, and then you need to develop understanding around that. So that's the first step. So based on your understanding of the goal of that particular government initiative, then you need to think about, okay, if that's the goal that government try to achieve for that particular policy or program, exactly what kind of communication may help the government achieve that role. So how communication may help achieving that particular the goal of that particular government initiative or the mission. So we need to try to identify the opportunity around communication that can actually help the government achieve their goals. And based on the communication opportunity we identify, we would need to define the goals, exactly what we are trying to achieve. So this is the opportunity, okay? Opportunity may be vague. In more tangible term, exactly what we try to achieve for that particular communication. So the next step will be to define the communication goals. And the next step is, as I said, you need to understand that's very good. You have a goal, and the goal fit into the overall government agency's view and the big picture. But exactly what would be the resource constraint? How much time you will have for you to achieve your goal, because that will affect whether your goal is achievable or is reasonable or not. So we need to actually understand the context around the communication goal we try to achieve, and that will help us build a business case. Okay, so those are the 4 activities we believe are essential for you to build a compelling case around your communication. So in the toolkit, you will also see something like this. So for each of the activity, we will specify the input, the tools and techniques that can help you with that particular activity, and also the output that will be generated out from the activity. So this is one example. So this is, say, for example, as I said, one critical activity in this particular phase is for you to define your communication goal. So in order for you to define your communication goal, you do have to have some information to start with, right? So that's why the input required for this particular activity will be some strategic goals about the communication initiative you try to communicate, and also some analysis report, your understanding around that government initiative, and also some opportunity prioritization table. And in order for you to develop the goals, what are the tools that can help you better define your goal? So when we talk about goal, we all know that the goal needs to be defined in SMART terms. But exactly what is meant by SMART? So in that particular toolkit, we will give you some example. The goal needs to be specific, needs to be measurable, and needs to be achievable, relevant, and also have a timeline. So in that particular, in the toolkit, we will talk about how you can define, how you may apply the SMART principle to define your communication goals with example. Okay, so that's the toolkit tools and techniques available. So one thing about the goal is that we want to make sure it's achievable, it's reasonable, right? But how are we going to do that? Benchmarking. So benchmarking is something that may help you with determination whether the goal is reasonable or not. So this is why we also believe benchmarking is something you also need to consider in this particular activity. And how are we going to know? How are we going to see how the communication goal fit into the entire organization? Benefit dependency map is something that can help you visualize where your goal, communication goals sit within the organization vision. So it will show you how the communication goals communicate to the government initiative objective, and how that may also fit into the organization vision. So those are the tools and techniques we will recommend. But as I said, this may change over time. So in the future, we believe it's still, I think, always a need for you to justify, to define the goals, right? So this won't change. But in the future, whenever there are new technology available for you, you can just update this particular section, and then you can perform the task with different tech tools and techniques. So at the end of this step, you should have a SMART defined communication goal, and you should also have the dependence map, visualize how your communication goals sit within the organization. So for each of the activity, you will see similar information like this. So this is just to give you an example about what we mean by input, process, and then the output. from the, this is, in the interview, we also asked the participant, the advisory group member, their view about specific phase. In addition to the overall framework, we asked their feedbacks and also their view on particular phase and particular activity. So this is what they said about the initiation phase. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, and I think they believe this is critical phase, but I think they also share their frustration in a way that they were not involved. They usually were not involved in this phase. Pretty much they will be hand-fit with something and you go and develop the communication strategy. So they don't have much room to actually shape the communication goal, let alone to decide whether the goal is indeed relevant or indeed measurable or something like that. So that actually creates a lot of problem because at the end of the day, the later phase, you need to measure the goal. If you don't have such information properly defined at the very beginning, how could you perform your evaluation at the end? So that's the frustration they have shared with us. But they like this because they believe this toolkit actually emphasizes, get to the point, it's endpoint on the need that this cannot be neglected. You do have to go through the process. But they also said something they struggle with. So first thing they have noticed that is that usually even if they are involved in the definition of the communication goal, they will not be provided with a clearly defined objective of the government initiative. The government initiative may have a very broad, vague objective. They don't even know what that is. And they are forced to actually develop the communication goal around that kind of vagueability. So that's the struggle. That's the thing they struggle with. And they would like to see that issues being addressed. Another thing they also want to see, which is what we are doing at the moment, is that when we talk about communication goals, usually it will about changing people's views, perception, educating, and changing their behavior, and also the knowledge in the long term. But what they find is difficult for them is that they know, okay, now we are going to educate people. We are going to change their perception or attitude around certain things. But how we are going to measure that? What are the measures available out there? So I think that's something they will also want to see, whether there are generic measures that can help them measure different generic goal, attitude, behavior, and also knowledge change and so on. So that's something we are in the process of developing for this particular toolkit. So after we finish the initiation phase, as I said, business case should be approved by senior executive, well-justified communication need. Then you move into the planning and design phase. So the planning and design phase will focus on who the target audience, the content, the message, and how you are going to communicate with them. So those are the key questions we try to address. And for this particular phase, we believe there are important activities that we need to actually focus on. The first activity we need to do to perform here is, of course, to identify the target audience. So who we are trying to communicate. And we need to get to know them better. What would be their motivation for behavior change if behavior change is something we aim for? What would be their behavior driver? Who influenced their behavior and so on? So we need to identify the target audience and then collect more information about them, and that can help us construct or draft the key message. Exactly for this particular group or target audience, what kind of message we need to get across, and then based on that, we will need to be able to determine for that particular group of target audience, what would be the best content, whether it's going to be video, whether it's going to be a website, or whether it's going to be a blog, and also the distribution channel, how we are going to get to the particular group of target audience. So that's the communication strategy. One thing I would like to point out here is that I think this is something we find in literature that suggests the best practice, which is the pilot test. We now develop a content communication strategy. We believe it will work, but we don't know for sure whether it will work or not. And by experience, we know there's a high chance it won't work according to what we plan. So one thing we notice here is that it suggests that it might be beneficial to run some pilot tests before you actually roll out at the full scale, your implementation, your communication strategy. So this is something they also like. So we said it may be beneficial to run some pilot tests, and I will give you more information about what we mean by that. We also understand, given the resource constraint, time constraint, there is no way you can run the full scale. And if it's a full scale, it won't be a pilot test. But there are several ways you can work around that. But they believe it's beneficial to have some pilot tests, so you will be able to see, at least detect some problem early on. And then after that, you develop the communication implementation plan, and then you identify some risks and opportunity. Risks are something that will affect preventing you from implementing your communication strategy plan, and whether there are opportunity available out there. That's some communication that is already in place and that can actually help you with your implementation. So that's the activities we suggest needs to be included. So similarly, for this particular phase in the toolkit, you will also see for each of the activity, the required suggested input, the tools and techniques, and also the output. So this is just one example. Actually, I'm going to give you two examples here. So I think this is the activity you need to define the target audience and get understanding around them, and then you need to have some input and then tools and techniques that can help you with. So I think from your background, you will learn that for communication project, interview, focus group, surveys are actually generic tool that has been used commonly. So you will see for a lot of activity, we will suggest you to conduct an interview. But the reality here is that sometimes you don't know, okay, you know you need to interview. You don't know who to interview. You don't know what kind of interview questions you may ask for that particular activity. Exactly what question, what information you try to get. So in the toolkit, you will probably see we suggest interview as the tool and techniques for several steps. But in the interview, in the toolkit, we will also throw in example questions you may use to conduct your interview. So at this, each time you don't have to struggle with trying to decide exactly what question you have to interview. So that's just to give you an understanding around the tools and techniques. So the next step, another step is the pilot test. And then this is what we have suggested. So there are several ways you can actually run the pilot, small-scale pilot test. Say, for example, you just conduct the pilot test or focus group with some target audience representative without going out to the full scale and so on. So pilot test is something we also find is interesting and well perceived by the industry. Yes? So I think this is the feedback, the planning and design phase. So basically they think the activities are well structured. And I think as compared with the initiation phase, industry practitioners are more comfortable with the design, the planning and design phase. I think this is the phase they are usually involved. They have relatively mature tools around the understanding of the target audience. They also know more in terms of communication channels and also the contents and so on. So as compared with the initiation phase, the tools, the knowledge around planning and design phase is relatively mature. That's what the feedback we have received. But they also believe that it's important to have a pilot test. However, they also acknowledge that sometimes in practice, they know it's beneficial to have a pilot test for this particular communication strategy, but they just don't have the resource and time to do that. They are forced, they need to rush into the next stage given the time frame. So this is the concerns they have, and we acknowledge that. So in the toolkits for some step like this, we will also provide some examples how you are going to work around the resource for that particular activity. We call it dirty trick. So just to help you work around certain tools and steps. So as I said, they challenge. Another challenge they face here is that they sometimes have a problem. They are not able to determine the right combination of the communication strategy given a very short time frame. So this is why in the toolkit, we will also have a list of the commonly used communication channels, and also some pros and cons associated with the channels, and maybe some suggestion for the selection of the communication channels and so on. So that's the planning and initiation phase. So the last phase of this process is the execution phase and then the evaluation phase. So this is the phase we focus on monitoring the communication strategy, and we try to see whether something goes well and whether something goes wrong, and we try to take some corrective actions to bring the communication project back to track. So for this particular phase, we believe there are 4 activities that need to be performed. So before you actually implement something, implement your communication strategy, you actually need to collect some baseline data. Because at the end of this phase, you need to measure the change before communication and after the communication. So this is the, I think we believe that we need to collect some baseline data before you can actually implement the communication strategy. And some interviewees actually suggest to bring this step a bit forward to early to an early phase, which we would do. We will probably do that. But nonetheless, they emphasize the need to collect pre-communication baseline data. So at the end, you will be able to use that to measure the change as a result of the communication. So in this phase, we also need to monitor and control the implementation. And at the end, we need to have a final project closure, and then also write the performance report, and also capture some lesson learned for a future project. So similarly, for this phase, you will also see the required input and the tools and techniques that can help you with certain activity, and also the output that will be generated at the end of each of the activity. So this is just to give you an example of the pre and communication baseline. So when we try to measure the goals of the communication, we need to actually have a pre and post comparison. Pre and post comparison. So in this case, several tools can help you with that. You can conduct a survey. It really depends on what goals you are trying to measure. If it's a behavior change, or you want to have a larger scale of data set, you probably need to go for survey. And then if you just want to know more detail why they change behavior, then focus group and interviews may be the best approach for you to do. But nonetheless, it's important to collect data before and after, so you will be able to see the change before it. And then I think we probably won't be able to do the full rigor, like a comparison, but to some degree, we need to justify whether the goal has been achieved or not at the end. So this is a very important step in the process. So from the feedback we received from the advisory group for this particular phase is that they think the government is mature in terms of monitoring and control the metrics, like how many visits to the website, the traffic to the blog, and so it's relatively mature, and they are comfortable with monitoring those things. But when it comes down to goal, behavior change and knowledge change and so on, they are relatively weak. And part of the reason is not because they don't think it's important. Part of the reason is that at the very beginning, there's no goal being clearly set. And they cannot just go travel back time to change that. So they can only work with what they have. So it's not like they believe, it's not like they don't think this phase is important, but it's just like sometimes when the project gets to this phase, there's really not much they can do if the contact hasn't been set up properly at the very beginning. So that's the comments, and then sometimes, so I think I touched this. Sometimes there is no baseline data or goal being set up at the very beginning, and this is the frustration they share in this particular phase. So what I have covered so far is the overall structure of the toolkits from the very beginning all the way to the end. And this toolkit can be used by different group of people in the government for different purpose. So say, for example, if you are a senior executive and you are in charge of the budget for communication. So what you can do here is that you can use this toolkit, the phase. Your focus will be on phase and the activity. So you can use this toolkit as a guideline in terms of what phase, and then if you are going to see the business case, exactly what information need to be included in the business case for you to make your decision. So for the senior executive, this toolkit can be a guideline that actually give you an outline of the key making point that you need to consider and what evidence you have to search for your decision making. So if you are a communicator, a communication leader, you are pretty much in charge of the planning of the communication project. This toolkit can give you an understanding or idea about the activities you need to manage in your project. And you look at the activity, you can decide who you are going to allocate within your team, who will be in the best position to perform which activity. You can use the list of the activity as a guideline to allocate, to manage your team, and so you can make sure all the activities are performed by the appropriate person, and they also have some tools and techniques that can help them with that. And if you are an experienced communicator, you have been doing this for many years, and you know something works, but you just don't know why. So this toolkit may give you some confidence. If you find some tools and techniques suggested in the toolkit is aligned with what you do and it works, then it can give you some credibility and confidence in terms of your practice. It can introduce that kind of rigor into your practice. If you are an entry-level communicator, if you are new to the field, then this toolkit can serve as an education tool to get you understanding around this. So for the organization, as I mentioned, we believe this can introduce some consistency, efficiency, and credibility into the practice, and then it can also be beneficial for long-term capability development if you are going to develop the talent within your organization. So this is the last slide I have for the methodology. So as I said, the development of this toolkit is an ongoing process. So the next step for us will be will continue to enrich the toolkit in several areas. One is that we are trying to add additional examples, case into the toolkit just to demonstrate how the toolkit may be applied to different contexts and what kind of, for some tools, how you can work around the resource constraint. If you are constrained by the resource, how you are going to tailor the toolkit for different purpose. And if you have any interesting examples within your organization and you want to share with us, please be in touch, and we are more than welcome to talk to you about those. And then we are going to add additional information about the goals, for different kind of communication goals, what would be some generic measures that you may consider, and then we are also trying to develop a selection guidelines for different communication strategy. Say, for example, if you are dealing with a particular type of target audience, what are the considerations you may have when you try to select the communication channels. So that's all from me for the research methodology. And as I said, you must feel a bit overwhelmed. It has nothing to do with simplicity at this time point, but we believe that in the long term, this can help you with the communication practice.